How's it going, everybody? Ryan here, and we are here with the first ever episode of Off the Record Fantasy Football, the fantasy football podcast that'll give you the best advice to dominate your league. Today, guys, we are going to be asking the question, what is fantasy football, and answering it here. And I want to say, before all the experienced players go ahead and click off and go find something else, I promise there's going to be some tidbits, some things for you guys to think about and consider here throughout this episode. So stick along and listen, and let's go ahead and talk off the record. What is fantasy football? I'm sure many of you are hearing about it. I'm sure many of you are talking about it. And I'm sure many of you are starting to think about it as we hit the 4th of July. Training camp will start in 3 weeks. That's where players, they come back and they just kind of start practicing again as a team. It's July 24th, I know, for the Buffalo Bills, which is my favorite team, but it kind of depends. But it is usually the end of July. And it's time to start thinking about fantasy football season again. I know it's been on my brain, and I'm sure many of you are going to hear about it at your 4th of July cookouts, at your 4th of July parties. Somebody's going to mention football. Somebody's going to mention fantasy football. Or if you've ever had any inkling about fantasy football at all and you don't hear it this weekend, maybe this podcast, while you're on your drive, you're going somewhere, put it on. Maybe you're at the gym. Go ahead and give it a listen. Let's answer the question. What is fantasy football? Simply, fantasy football is a game. It's a fantasy sport. Like, okay, sure, maybe not a sport, but it's definitely a fantasy game where you draft a team of real life NFL players. The draft happens once a year, and you go ahead and you play those players throughout the season. You start them. You get to choose, who do I want at quarterback this week? Who do I want at running back from the team that you drafted? And based on the team that you put in your starting lineup, how they do in real life dictates how you score in fantasy. You score points based on how they do on the field. You have weekly head-to-head matchups where you compete against another one of your league members. Now, not every league does head-to-head matchups, but it is the most prominent version, the most prominent style, the most prominent setting is to do head-to-head weekly matchups. Whoever scores the most points from their starting lineup wins that week. The teams that accumulate the most wins throughout the regular fantasy season get to play in the fantasy playoffs for the fantasy championship. You'll play throughout the NFL regular season, weeks 1 through 18, not the actual NFL playoffs. Typically, fantasy football seasons will end 1 week before the regular season ends. So the penultimate week of the NFL season is when your fantasy championship is most likely. It'll be week 17. And depending on the size of your league, you could see your playoffs start around week 15, maybe week 14 or week 16. But it's going to be somewhere in that range, which puts it square in the heart of December. And that is playoff time. But your league can have many different types of settings. So definitely check your league settings. Ask your commissioner. Go in the app, whatever you're using. If you're already in the league, go ahead and check that out. But we will touch on here the different types of settings your league could have. And if you're setting up your league for the first time, hopefully this episode, I should say, and the whole podcast, screw it. Hopefully it all gets you guys ready to go this fall. Set up your league, start talking to people around the cookout on the 4th of July, or maybe wait until August. I know it's pretty early for a lot of regular people to ponder fantasy football, but I'm not regular. I'm very hardcore into fantasy football, and I love it, which is why I'm sitting here talking to you guys. But let's jump into those league settings I mentioned. The first thing we want to talk about is, how many friends do you need? Do you need a lot of friends, or do you not need a lot of friends? Well, I mean, you could control multiple teams in the league yourself, but that's no fun. We want friends. It's more fun with friends and the rivalries and the jokes and the smack talk along the way. Typically, you could see leagues range from 8, 10, 12 teams. You do need an even amount of teams in almost every platform I've seen. But you can have as small as 4-team leagues. So if you only have 3 friends, or you're asking mom, dad, and your sister to join a league because you're just starting, you can have 4. Or if you're really crazy and you just love pain, you could go all the way up to 32 teams I've seen. I highly recommend 10 or 12. I think that is the best experience. 12-team leagues, you're going to see a little thinner at the bottom of rosters. You won't have as many really elite talents on your team, which can balance it out. 10, you got a few more, maybe one more superstar a bit more depth, but it's not that much more. Once you start to get 8 or smaller, you are starting to look at, a lot of teams where they're just ridiculously stacked. And when you go to 14, that's probably the biggest I'd ever consider. If you go 14 or higher, you're really looking at thin rosters where 1 or maybe 2 players make or break it. I think 10 to 12 is that sweet spot for me. So if you guys can find 9 to 11 of your friends, invite them to join your fantasy football league or join one that's probably like those, 10 to 12. Highly recommend if you're being asked to join an 8-team league, see if you can get more people to join with you. I just think the experience is better at 10 or 12, right? But it depends on the league type as well, right? You could have 16 teams. Depending on the league type, it might not be that bad. There are 4 main types of leagues that you guys are probably going to be faced with this fall. Now, some of you that are experienced might be in our latter 3, but this first one is for the majority of people that want to play fantasy football. It's the most talked about version, and it's the most popular version. It's called a redraft league. What that means is that fantasy draft that I mentioned earlier, you do that every year. And every year your roster gets reset going back into the draft. You don't get to keep that superstar you drafted last season. You got to put them back in the pot and start over fresh. I think this is the most enjoyable way for everybody. For your hardcore players, maybe you want to try some of our later leagues. But if you just want to have fun and take it seriously, but also just be a little casual, not have to be up on every single beat reporter's Twitter feed at 2 a.m., stick with the redraft leagues. That's the way that if you win the league, heck, you could have the worst team next season. And if you came in last, well, a redraft league gives you a clean slate to go ahead and start over and potentially draft that winning roster that gets you, well, a little bit more respect from your league mates. And now, I'm not trying to advocate for any negativity, but it's a competition. It's supposed to be fun and it's supposed to be lighthearted, but you want to win. We're in this to win, right? We're not here to just join and have a good time, right? You may say you are, but it feels better on Monday and Tuesday morning when you win rather than when you lose. The next type of league is called a keeper league. It's essentially like a redraft, except your league sets how many players you get to keep, hence the name keeper. So for example, if you had a 2-player keeper league, you get to keep 2 of your players. You decide who you want from last year's roster to keep. The rest go back into that redraft pool and you will redraft the rest of your roster. Say you drafted somebody or stashed them or just held on to them throughout the entire season and you like them, right? You thought they had upside for next season. It didn't quite hit. Well, that's a guy that you can keep and you don't have to waste a draft pick on him. And then you just go back in. Now, there are different types of keeper where you may have to sacrifice a pick. So, for example, if you keep one of the top players in the league, you may have to sacrifice your first-round pick and not get to pick with your league mates in that first round. Other leagues just say keep whoever you want and then just redraft. Everybody has a first-round pick, so everybody's probably going to keep the top players. So that's set more so on the platform's basis. What value a player has. I believe it's where they're usually drafted in this upcoming year. So, for example, if you're going to keep Jonathan Taylor, who you snagged last season, he's the Indianapolis Colts running back. For those who don't know who he is, he was an absolute machine, monster, absolutely dominant force. And if you picked him up in the 2nd or 3rd round last year, you probably want to keep him again because he's going to go first overall. And you'd be fine keeping giving up your first overall pick for Jonathan Taylor. But say you didn't want to deal with any of this. Who do I keep? Who do I let go back? I don't want to see all my precious players go into the hands of my rival. Well, you can join a dynasty league. Start a dynasty league. Do your draft, and that is your roster. This most reflects how an NFL team conducts its business. I know it's still fantasy football, and you're not going to get anything one for one. There is a site out there, I believe at least one I know of, that you can actually operate with a salary cap. But Dynasty League, you draft your team, and then every year you just draft rookies, just like the entry draft does in the NFL. You keep your team. So you need an upgrade at quarterback? Well, you either need to draft one of the rookies and hope they do well, or trade for one. And you can trade your picks. Now, every league is probably going to allow or disallow, but it's always an option. Trading of picks, right? So even redraft leagues, you can trade your picks. But in a dynasty league, it becomes a bit more advanced. Now, we're getting a little bit more hardcore here, but for example, you could trade, your next year's third round pick for a player this year, and you just wouldn't have a pick in the third round of fantasy football drafts. And fantasy football third rounders are much more valuable than a real life third rounder. So you do have to kind of put on your fantasy football hat and take off your NFL fan hat. And if you're new to fantasy football and don't really watch a lot of the games or aren't following it too closely, I highly recommend you start with redraft. It's probably the best. We're going to get up to another, a more casual league than redraft, but still one that I think for newcomers, I would steer clear. For newcomers, highly recommend redraft. But the fourth and final league type we're going to talk about is best ball. Best ball, kind of what it sounds like. You draft a team, usually with a larger roster size, and the best players, however they scored that week, are the ones that are in your starting lineup. Now, you have no control over your roster after draft day. You just draft and then watch it. You let it ride. With best ball, say you draft Daniel Jones and Tom Brady. Well, more likely than not, Tom Brady's going to outperform Daniel Jones every week. But those weeks that Daniel Jones does outperform Tom Brady, he's in your quote unquote starting lineup. And usually it's done on an aggregate format. So they will total each week your starting lineup and kind of add it to a running total. And the top few teams at the end of the season, they'll win. If you have a prize pool, you can divvy it up by that. But basically by the end of the season, whoever team scored the most gets to wins the league, obviously. But you don't get to trade. You don't get to just pick up free agents. You don't get to drop players, or you don't get to decide who starts. I mean, obviously, it's going to set the optimal lineup, the players who scored the most, so you don't need to worry about that, which is kind of a threat in Redraft, Keeper, and Dynasty. You do need to make the right decisions, which is why you're here. You're listening to Off the Record, which is the best spot for fantasy football advice this fall. A lot of good stuff coming. I'm very excited, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast. But best ball takes that out of your hands. So we're not going to talk about best ball because it means I don't have something to do every week. But I'm kidding. Obviously, best ball. We're going to talk about the upside of players in best ball and players maybe to target with some upside, some sleepers as well. Sleepers are categorized as players who are being drafted quite low but have tremendous upside. So that's what you would consider a sleeper. There's also the Sleeper platform, which is the app I host my fantasy football league on. So maybe use that one. I highly recommend it. It's pretty nice. It's got a lot of information, but you don't always have to use that information. But plug for Sleeper, just because I love them. Aside, let's talk about roster construction. Now, I talked about your starting lineup, but each league can have a different type of starting lineup. There is the standard starting lineup that if you just say on ESPN, I want to start a fantasy football league, and you just click continue until you're ready to go. The roster that you'll be looking at are starting spots for 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, what is called a flex position, which I will touch on here in a second, a defense and special teams, and finally a kicker. Now, your league commissioner who runs your league can decide what kind of roster structure you have. I know in my league, we just got rid of kickers in favor of another flex position. Well, what is this mysterious flex position, you might ask? It's a position where you can put any player you want besides a quarterback. You put a running back, a wide receiver, or a tight end in your flex position. Why can't you put a kicker or a defense in your flex? I'm not sure. The question's been asked to me, and all I can say is, I don't know. But those inquisitive minds that do, I wish I had a platform for you. But the standard roster structure is a flex is a wide receiver, running back, or tight end. The reason I keep saying wide receiver first is it kind of becomes a third wide receiver spot if you only have one. The reason I got rid of kickers and got a second one is because it adds a bit more variety to who you play every week. But that's the standard flex. You can make it just running back and wide receiver. You can make it just wide receiver, tight end. You can just make it running back, tight end. You can pretty much make it whatever you want. But there is one more type of flex that I haven't touched on. You guys might be asking, why can't I put a quarterback in there? Well, if you are in a super flex league, you can. Super flex leagues allow you to put quarterbacks in that flex position. Now, that flex position, like I said, can change every week, and it really puts a premium on quarterbacks. You'll notice in regular leagues, regular redraft, standard roster leagues, quarterbacks, they've got good value, but you're generally taking a couple of running backs, a couple of wide receivers, maybe one of each before you start even thinking about a quarterback. In a Superflex league, you better get your quarterbacks, because if a 12-team Superflex league, you need 24 quarterbacks drafted. You're going to take 2 quarterbacks just because of the way the scoring works, which we will touch on in a second, but you'll be taking 2 quarterbacks. You don't want the 24th best quarterback, so it definitely adds a lot more there. Certain quarterbacks like Trevor Lawrence, who aren't even being considered as starters in most 12-team leagues, those guys get so much more value. Trey Lance, I know, has got some excitement around him. I'll hold off on dropping names until we get to the next episode, which we'll be talking about things to avoid and not to do. We'll try to touch on some players, maybe as an example. But for now, we'll just leave it simple. Superflex leagues, you get to play a quarterback in that flex position. And, obviously the flex position, you can decide how many of those you want. Really, it's all about your league, and that's the fun part. I can give you the most advice for a standard league. I can give you the most advice that you can then take and transpose into your league. But at the end of the day, you could have a whole roster of flex positions and just play whoever the heck you want, as many of them as you want. That's kind of crazy. But now, how do I get points for these players, you might be asking? I might be starting a quarterback and 2 receivers and somebody in my flex, but how do I get points for them? You said you get points for how they do in real life. And yeah, that's right. You get points based on the statistical achievements of the players on the field. For example, you get points for rushing yards, you get points for receiving yards, you get points for touchdowns, you get points for passing yards, you get points for a sack from your defense, or you lose points if your quarterback throws an interception. So let's dive into those different types of scoring. Now, there are 3 main scoring types to talk about. They're standard, half PPR, and full PPR. And for those that don't know, PPR stands for points per reception. A reception is a catch. So half a point for PPR, you get half a point for every catch, and a full point PPR, you get a full point for a catch. And then standard, you get no points for a catch because we don't dole out points for players just catching the ball at the line of scrimmage. But the main scoring for most leagues, we'll dive into the points per reception in a bit. I'll break down the differences between half PPR and PPR, maybe in another episode if you guys want to hear that. But usually, you will see 10 rushing yards or 10 receiving yards equals 1 fantasy point. You can have decimal scoring enabled too, which is my preferred way to do it. You don't really see any ties, if any, if you're doing decimal scoring. So 7 rushing yards equals 0.7 points. 45 receiving yards equals 4.5 fantasy points. And then for passing yards, we stray a bit. You'll notice that passing and quarterbacks kind of get a little bit of a different rule set applied to them. So instead of every 10 yards being 1 fantasy point for quarterbacks passing the ball, it's every 25 passing yards equals 1 point. So to get 4 fantasy points for a running back, you need 40 rushing yards or a combination of rushing and receiving yards. But we'll stick with just one category for now. For 4 fantasy points for a running back, 40 rushing yards. For 4 fantasy points for a quarterback, you need 100 passing yards, which is a lot more doable because they're the only one throwing the ball on any given play. They throw the ball about 20, 30, 40 times a game. So you'd expect them to rack up the majority of those stats. Hence why quarterbacks can throw for 5,000 yards, and that's the achievement. But a running back rushes for 1,000 yards, and that's the achievement, which is kind of why they changed the scoring a bit in standard leagues. Touchdowns also operate the same way. A rushing or receiving touchdown gets you 6 points, but a passing touchdown gets you 4 points. For example, if you have both the team's quarterback and the team's wide receiver, and the quarterback passes the ball to your receiver for a touchdown, you'll get 4 points from your quarterback and 6 points for your wide receiver. That would get you 10 fantasy points for that one play, and that's what's called a stack. We can talk about those later, but again, we're just answering the question, what is fantasy football? The points per reception, that's where it does make a difference. In standard, you're getting nothing. half point PPR, you're getting 0.5 points for every catch. And full point PPR is 1 point for every catch. So, for example, a 20-yard reception in standard would get you 2 points. A 20-yard reception in half point PPR would get you 2.5. And finally, I'm sure you guys can guess where I'm going here, a 20-yard catch in full point PPR is 3 points. I don't want to sound patronizing here, guys, but I at least want to break it down so we all understand how we're doing it. Defensively, you get points there as well. Usually you'll get points based off of yards allowed or points allowed. Some leagues only do points allowed. I know, for example, DraftKings, I know they don't do season-long fantasy, but they're daily fantasy. You'll only get points from your defense for yards, for points, not yards. I don't like yards. I don't think that's a very good way to score defenses. I care more about how many points a defense gives up. I've always used this example, but if a defense allows 1,000 yards and 12 points, I care more about the 12 points because I'm probably going to win. Whoop-de-doo, you got 1,000 yards, and, well, you probably need to talk about that, how the other team didn't score more than 12 points. But I think 12 points should be looked on more favorably than yards allowed. You'll also get points for turnovers. So, for example, if your quarterback throws an interception, that'd be -2 points for their total. And you can have players end up in the negative. That is 100% possible, and I've seen it happen, and it's never fun when it happens to you. But if your defense intercepts the opposing quarterback, you'll get +2 points. Same thing if they fumble. Same points apply. Your running back fumbles, -2. Defense recovers a fumble, +2. A sack is also worth 1 point. A blocked field goal can be worth points as well. And we can dive deeper and deeper. There's so many categories we can go to, but we're going to talk about the standard, what you boot up a league with. You can maybe choose half point PPR or full point PPR. That's really the only stat category that's going to change. For the most part, they're the same. And now kickers, I'm not a fan of kickers. I will touch on kickers and how they score. We can go into why I hate kickers so much in another episode. But today, we'll just talk about kickers and how they score. As our last part of this scoring segment, kickers will get a point for every 10 yards, essentially. So, yes, 0 to 30, I should say, 0 to 39 are the same 3 points. So, it kind of sucks there. You can enable decimal scoring, I believe, for kickers. I've not seen that happen. Could be interesting. But in a standard league, you'll see 3 points awarded for a 38-yard field goal or a 10-yard field goal. Also, it goes up from there. So 40 to 49 is 4 points. 50 to 59 is 5 points. And if your guy hits a 60-plus field goal, you have Justin Tucker, and he's getting you 6 points. They can also get 1 point for every PAT. That's that point. That's how we get 7 out of a touchdown. Yeah, the PAT. You get 1 point for that. However, if they miss a field goal, you lose a point. And if they miss a PAT, you also lose a point. So that's how kickers score. Defenses score that way. There's also these things called IDPs, which are the individual defensive players. If you want to draft a linebacker, if you want to draft a defensive tackle, if you want to draft a corner, have your league enable that. I personally would rather just get rid of defenses altogether. I think defensive scoring needs some readjustments and some reworking, but that's just me. But you can enable that as well. You can have punters, you can have head coaches, you can have just about whatever you want. So at the end of the day, guys, fantasy football is all about fun. Make sure it's fun. Don't take it too seriously. Don't join a money league if you're not ready to lose some money. Just have fun. Go banter with your friends. Talk some smack. Make those waiver wire. Tell them to listen to Off the Record Fantasy Football because that's where you're going to get the information to win. Guys, we're going to win many, many leagues this season, and we're going to have a lot of fun along the way, and that's what it's all about. It's not about the championships. It's about the fun we had along the way, but also about those championships. So, guys, thank you so much for listening. Go out there, have some fun. We'll be talking to you soon. Make sure to leave a rating on the podcast, however you think it was. Also, if you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe, and I will talk to you guys again soon.